What if I told you that the document sitting in a temperature-controlled vault in Washington, D.C., the one every American schoolchild learns about, the one framed on classroom walls across the country, has 99 stories hiding behind it that almost nobody knows? Not the version they taught you in civics class, not the sanitized highlights about freedom and democracy and the genius of the founding fathers. The other stories, the desperate compromises, the backroom deals, the secrets that nearly tore the whole thing apart before the ink was even dry. You probably think you know the Constitution. Maybe you remember the 3 branches of government, the Bill of Rights, something about checks and balances. But here's what they didn't tell you. The men who wrote that document were terrified, exhausted, deeply divided, and in some cases, actively working against each other. The convention that produced it nearly collapsed 17 times. Some of the founders hated what they created. One of them called it a mere shadow of a plan. Another refused to sign it entirely and spent the rest of his life trying to tear it down. And that's just the beginning. Over the next little while, we're going to move through 99 stories, some shocking, some heartbreaking, some almost absurd, all of them real, all of them documented, and all of them hiding in plain sight inside the history of America's founding document. So before we begin, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. These deep dive history stories take real work to put together, and the algorithm doesn't always make them easy to find. Your support is what keeps them coming. Now settle in, get comfortable, and let's start at the very beginning, with a convention so chaotic, so secretive, and so close to total failure that it's a miracle any document came out of it at all. 1. The summer of 1787, Philadelphia. A red brick building on Chestnut Street that most people today would recognize immediately from every textbook they've ever opened. Independence Hall, specifically the assembly room on the ground floor, where just 11 years earlier the Declaration of Independence had been signed. The same room, the same wooden floors, the same high windows looking out onto the street. Except this time, those windows were shut and locked. It was one of the hottest summers Philadelphia had seen in years, and the men inside were sweating through their coats in the June heat, but the windows stayed closed. They stayed closed because the debates happening inside those walls were not meant for public ears. Merchants passed on the street outside. Newspaper reporters loitered near the entrance, hoping to catch a stray word. Citizens of Philadelphia knew something important was happening in there and desperately wanted to know what. The delegates gave them nothing. Guards were posted at the doors. When a delegate accidentally left a copy of a working proposal on the floor, George Washington reportedly picked it up, pocketed it, and delivered one of the only speeches of his entire time at the convention, a cold, measured warning that whoever had been careless enough to leave it there should be more careful. Nobody ever claimed it. That room, sealed tight against the summer air and the curious public, became a pressure cooker. And like any pressure cooker, what came out of it was shaped entirely by the heat inside. The secrecy wasn't incidental to the Constitution. In a very real sense, it was the precondition for it. Without those locked windows, the whole thing might have fallen apart in the first week. 2. Before a single argument was made about representation or taxation or the powers of the executive, the delegates agreed on one thing. Nobody talks about what happens in this room. The secrecy rule was one of the first official acts of the Constitutional Convention, adopted before any substantive debate began. Every delegate was bound by it. No letters home with details. No conversations with wives or colleagues outside. No leaks to the press. And this wasn't just a polite gentleman's agreement. It was a calculated political strategy because everyone in that room understood something important. If the public knew what they were actually debating, the whole convention would be dead on arrival. The Articles of Confederation still had passionate defenders. Certain states were deeply suspicious of anything that looked like centralized power. If word got out too early that some delegates were proposing to scrap the Articles entirely and start over, the backlash would have been immediate and overwhelming. The secrecy rule created a protected space where a delegate could float a radical idea in the morning, get torn apart for it, modify it, abandon it, or revive it a week later without being publicly committed to any of it. It allowed minds to change without embarrassment. It allowed compromises to happen without constituencies getting in the way. It was, in a strange sense, one of the most democratically effective acts of the entire convention. And it held, mostly. Benjamin Franklin had to be watched carefully around dinner guests who might ask him questions. But the seal held until the convention ended in September. The full picture of what happened in that room didn't emerge until decades later, and even then, only partially. 3. George Washington sat at the front of the room on a raised platform, presiding over the convention in a high-backed wooden chair that would later become one of the most famous pieces of furniture in American history. And for most of the convention, he sat there almost completely silent. This is the part that surprises people. Washington, the most famous man in America, the hero of the Revolution, the person whose presence alone gave the entire convention a legitimacy it otherwise might not have had. He gave almost no speeches. He cast exactly one vote on a procedural matter near the very end. He did not argue for specific provisions. He did not publicly take sides in the convention's most heated debates. What he did was sit there, and it turned out that was exactly enough. His presence meant the convention could not easily be dismissed as a gathering of fringe radicals trying to seize power. His silence meant he couldn't be accused of trying to install himself as a king, which was a genuine fear some people held. His reputation was essentially on loan to the process, and every delegate in that room knew it. They also knew that whatever document came out of Philadelphia, Washington's willingness to associate himself with it would be essential to its ratification. So when debates turned vicious, when delegates threatened to walk out, when the whole project seemed to be unraveling, Washington's calm presence on that platform was a kind of ballast. He didn't need to say anything. His being there said enough. And the delegates, most of them, behaved accordingly. 4. Here's a thing that could have easily gone differently. We almost don't know what happened at the Constitutional Convention. The official journal of the convention was thin, procedural, almost useless as a historical record. It listed motions and votes. It didn't capture arguments. The moments of anger, the compromises being hammered out in real time. The ideas that were floated and shot down and rebuilt into something else. If we relied only on the official record, the Constitutional Convention would be a mystery. What we have instead is James Madison. Madison was 36 years old that summer, the youngest serious intellectual force in the room, and he was obsessed with getting it right. He took a seat near the front of the chamber where he could hear everything, and he wrote. Every day, every speech, paraphrased or quoted as closely as he could manage. Every exchange, every argument. He went home each evening and expanded his notes while the day was still fresh. It was an extraordinary act of discipline that his health, which was never robust, nearly couldn't sustain. Madison's notes weren't published until after his death in 1836, nearly 50 years after the convention ended. He held them back deliberately, believing that publishing them during the lifetimes of the participants might inflame old arguments or be used as political weapons. But when they finally came out, they transformed our understanding of the founding entirely. Almost everything we know about what actually happened in that room, we know because one man decided to write it down. Think about that. The history of the Constitution is, in large part, the history of James Madison's handwriting. 5. On the last day of the convention, September 17th, 1787, the delegates were signing the finished document, or trying to. Some were refusing. The mood in the room was complicated. Relief mixed with exhaustion, mixed with genuine uncertainty about whether this thing they'd built was actually going to work. And then Benjamin Franklin spoke. Franklin was 81 years old that summer. He'd been carried to the convention in a sedan chair because he was too frail to walk the Philadelphia streets. He hadn't been able to stand at the podium to deliver his own speeches. A younger delegate had read them on his behalf. But he'd been there, watching, thinking, and on this final day he had something to say about the chair. Washington's presiding chair had a carving on its back. A sun, low on the horizon, with rays extending outward. For the entire summer, Franklin said, he had looked at that chair and wondered. Painters, he explained, find it difficult to distinguish a rising sun from a setting sun. And throughout the convention, he had not been able to tell which one it was. He'd sat there through the arguments and the failures and the near collapses and watched that painted sun and couldn't decide. But now, he said, at last he had the happiness to know that it was a rising, not a setting sun. It's one of the most quoted moments in American founding history. It's also worth noting that Franklin, ever the diplomat, was choosing to be optimistic in public. In private correspondence, he had real doubts. But in that room on that day, he chose the rising sun. And the line stuck. 6. There were 13 states in 1787. 12 of them sent delegates to Philadelphia. One didn't show up at all. Rhode Island, the smallest state in the Union, and in some ways the most defiant. Rhode Island didn't just fail to send delegates, it actively refused to send them. The state legislature voted against participation entirely. And the reasons were not subtle. Rhode Island in the 1780s had a particular economic arrangement it was quite happy with. It had been printing paper money and using it to pay off debts, a policy that creditors hated and debtors loved. A stronger national government with the power to regulate commerce and currency would almost certainly put an end to that. Rhode Island also had a deep-seated suspicion of concentrated authority going back to its founding by Roger Williams as a haven for religious dissenters and political independence. The other states were not entirely surprised, but they were irritated. Delegates in Philadelphia made pointed remarks about the absent state. There were jokes. There was also genuine concern that a new constitution without Rhode Island's support would struggle to achieve the unanimous ratification that some felt was necessary. Rhode Island eventually ratified the Constitution in 1790, the last of the original 13 states to do so, and only after the new federal government made clear it was prepared to treat Rhode Island as a foreign nation and impose trade tariffs. Even then, Rhode Island ratified by a margin of 2 votes. Some things apparently don't change. Rhode Island came in last and came in reluctant, all the way to the very end. 7. The first substantive plan laid on the table came from Virginia, and it did not think small. Edmund Randolph, tall, formal, speaking for the largest and most populous state in the room, rose early in the convention and presented what became known as the Virginia Plan. It didn't tinker with the articles, it effectively threw them in the trash. A powerful national government with 3 branches. A legislature with 2 houses, and in both houses, representation based on population or financial contribution, not on equal state votes. Large states would have more seats, small states would have fewer. It was a direct assault on the idea that each state, regardless of size, was politically equal. 8. If Virginia's proposal was a shot across the bow of small states, the response came almost immediately from New Jersey. William Paterson, who was not impressed with the idea that his much smaller state should simply accept permanent political second-class status, introduced what became known as the New Jersey Plan. It kept the basic structure of the Articles of Confederation, a single unicameral legislature where each state had 1 vote. It did grant the central government new powers to tax and regulate commerce, but it drew a hard line at representation. States in this vision remained sovereign units that entered the Union as equals and should remain equals. Population didn't matter. Geography didn't matter. A farmer in Delaware was not worth less on paper than a planter in Virginia. 9. The confrontation between the Virginia and New Jersey plans nearly blew the whole convention apart, and the delegates knew it. Large states were not going to back down from the idea that more people should mean more representation. Small states were not going to sign on to a system that let them be permanently outvoted on everything that mattered. The answer, when it finally came, was a compromise so basic that it's easy to forget how radical it was. 2 houses, not 1. In the House of Representatives, seats apportioned by population, as Virginia wanted. In the Senate, each state getting 2 senators, as New Jersey demanded. 1 chamber for the people, 1 for the states. It was mathematically inelegant, politically necessary, and the only reason the convention didn't collapse. 10. But once you tie representation to population, a brutal question rises to the surface in a country built on slavery. Counted how? Counted who? Southern slaveholding states wanted enslaved people fully counted for representation, swelling their seats in the House without granting those people any political rights. Many Northern delegates, opposed to slavery or at least its political expansion, argued that if enslaved people were treated as property under state law, they shouldn't be counted as persons for representation. The compromise they reached was the now infamous 3/5 clause. For purposes of representation and direct taxation, all other persons would be counted at 3/5 of a person. It was a numerical formula written across human bodies, a moral fault line embedded directly into the Constitution's math. 11. The 3/5 formula wasn't the only place slavery seeped into the structural wiring of the new government. Another explosive question was whether Congress, newly empowered to regulate foreign and interstate commerce, could also choke off the transatlantic slave trade. Some delegates, especially from the Upper South and North, wanted the power to end it immediately. Deep South states threatened to walk if their ability to import enslaved Africans was touched. The eventual bargain was as cold as it sounds. Congress would get broad power over commerce, including tariffs and navigation laws. In exchange, the Constitution would explicitly bar any federal prohibition of the migration or importation of persons before 1808. 20 years of guaranteed legal human trafficking, locked in by design in a document otherwise obsessed with limiting government power. 12. And then there was the problem of choosing a president, which turned out to be another exercise in distrust carefully disguised as design. Many delegates recoiled at the idea of direct national election, arguing that voters scattered across a vast continent would lack information and be easily swayed. Others feared letting Congress choose the executive, worried it would turn the president into a creature of the legislature or invite corruption. The Electoral College emerged as a compromise no one truly loved but enough people could tolerate. States would appoint electors, in a number tied to their representatives and senators, who would formally cast the votes for president. It was indirect by intent, a buffer between popular passions and the highest office, and another reminder that the framers trusted structures more than they trusted people. 13. Once the shouting over big questions quieted, someone had to actually turn vague resolutions into sentences, sections, and clauses. That job fell to the Committee of Detail, a small group chosen in late July, and handed a stack of agreed-upon votes, plus a very fuzzy mandate: make this into a working constitution. They withdrew from the main hall, pored over state constitutions, earlier plans, and even the Articles of Confederation, and began stitching it all together. When they returned, they didn't just bring back a tidy transcript of what had been said. They had filled in blanks, organized powers, and made choices about structure that no one had specifically voted on. Their draft quietly elevated national supremacy, clarified judicial authority, and sorted out the enumerated powers of Congress, becoming the skeleton on which everything else would be hung. 14. But even with a full draft in hand, some of the most explosive questions were still sitting in the "we'll figure it out later" pile. So the convention did what institutions always do with difficult problems. It created another committee. The Committee on Postponed Parts, meeting in early September, inherited all the unresolved issues no one had wanted to nail down in open debate. Chief among them was the presidency. How long should a president serve? Could they be re-elected? How exactly would this new electoral college work in practice? The committee recommended a 4-year term, unlimited re-eligibility, and the complex fallback procedure where, if no candidate won an electoral majority, the House would choose the president by state delegations. They also refined the vice presidency, succession, and treaties. In one sweep, a handful of men quietly shaped the executive branch that would dominate American politics. 15. Once the structure was settled, there was still the matter of how the document sounded, which turned out not to be a cosmetic question at all. Gouverneur Morris of Pennsylvania, sharp-tongued, aristocratic, and one of the better prose stylists in the room, was handed the near-final draft and told to clean it up. What came back was not just a copy-edited version but a reimagined voice. He standardized phrasing, tightened rambling sections, and reordered clauses for emphasis. Most famously, he transformed a dry state-by-state preamble into something far more ambitious and declarative. His pen turned a legal compact into a kind of secular scripture. The cadences he chose, the way he stacked ideas, would echo in American political speech for centuries, proving that in constitutional design, style can quietly become substance. 16. The most famous words in that new preamble were not inevitable. They were a choice that carried an entire theory of government. Early drafts had opened with a list of states, something like "We the people of New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island," and so on down the line. Morris swept all that away and replaced it with three blunt, sweeping words: "We the people." In one stroke, the document stopped sounding like a contract among sovereign states and started claiming authority directly from a single national people. Critics would later argue that this language was rhetorical sugar over a still federal structure. Supporters would point to it as the clearest statement of popular sovereignty in the entire text. Either way, the shift framed every later debate. Was this union a pact of governments, or an expression of one people acting in the aggregate? 17. For all its grand opening language, the Constitution the delegates signed in September 1787 had a conspicuous absence that nearly sank it. There was no Bill of Rights, no explicit guarantee of freedom of speech, press, or religion, no protections against unreasonable searches, cruel punishments, or compelled self-incrimination. Many framers thought one wasn't necessary, or even dangerous. The federal government, they argued, had only the power specifically granted. If a power wasn't given, it didn't exist, so why list what it couldn't do? Others worried that listing some rights would imply that unlisted rights didn't exist. Outside the hall, however, skeptics saw the omission as ominous. State constitutions had bills of rights. Why not this vastly more powerful national charter? During ratification, opposition crystallized around that missing shield. The promise that amendments would quickly add one became the key political bargain that nudged several reluctant states into the yes column. 18. Tucked deep in Article I, Section 8, after a sober list of things Congress may do, sits a short, flexible time bomb. It's the necessary and proper clause, authorizing Congress to make all laws necessary and proper for carrying into execution its enumerated powers and those of the other branches. To some framers, this was a mere housekeeping measure, an obvious implication written down to prevent nitpicking. To others, especially later anti-federalists, it was a blank check in graceful cursive. Did necessary mean strictly indispensable, or merely convenient and useful? Would this clause let Congress stretch its listed powers to cover anything it could plausibly link to them? Fights over a national bank, internal improvements, and later federal regulation all turned on that quiet phrase. The clause became the legal hinge allowing the constitutional text to bend without, its defenders insisted, actually breaking. 19. Right after the framers listed the powers of Congress and sketched a new federal judiciary, they quietly planted a hierarchy into the legal soil. Article VI's Supremacy Clause declared that the Constitution, federal laws made under it, and treaties were the supreme law of the land, binding on state judges anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. To some delegates, this was just common sense. If the Union was going to mean anything, national rules had to prevail when there was a conflict. To others, it sounded like an eraser hovering over state sovereignty. Anti-federalists later warned that this clause, combined with broad readings of federal power, would let national law swallow state authority. Federalists answered that state governments would still handle most daily life. The clause sat there short and tidy, waiting for future courts to decide how sharp its teeth really were. 20. Not far from that supremacy language, another small phrase opened a philosophical sinkhole that Congress and courts have been peering into ever since. The first line of Article I, Section 8 gives Congress power to tax and spend to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. General welfare sounded wholesome, almost soothing, but its meaning was contested from the start. Was Congress limited to spending only in ways tied directly to its other listed powers, or could it fund anything plausibly serving the nation's overall well-being? Hamilton later argued for a broad view. If spending promoted national welfare, it was fair game. Madison insisted that reading turned a limited government into one with virtually unlimited purse strings. Debates over social programs, infrastructure, subsidies, and conditional grants to states would all circle back to that placid little phrase and what, exactly, welfare was supposed to cover. 21. For all the lofty talk of liberty, one of the most morally fraught bargains of the convention was written in evasive, careful language. Article 5 includes what later came to be called the Fugitive Slave Clause, though the word slave never appears. Instead, it speaks of persons held to service or labor who escape into another state, and requires that they be delivered up to the party to whom such service is owed. Delegates from slaveholding states insisted on this protection, fearing that otherwise enslaved people who reached a free state might gain safety. Some northern delegates accepted the clause as the grim price of union, others disliked it but saw no path to a constitution without it. The euphemisms did not change the reality. The National Charter obligated states, including those that later abolished slavery, to help enforce human bondage. The Constitution's silence on the word did nothing to soften its effect. 22. Another compromise over slavery appears in Article I, couched again in abstract terms that half hide what was being traded. The importation clause barred Congress from prohibiting the migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit before the year 1808, though it allowed a tax on each person brought in. Southern delegates, especially from South Carolina and Georgia, insisted on this guarantee to protect the transatlantic slave trade for at least 20 more years. Some other delegates, uneasy with the trade, consoled themselves that a delayed power to ban it was better than no power at all. The 1808 date became a kind of moral horizon written into the document. When Congress finally outlawed the importation of enslaved people as soon as it could, the domestic slave trade within the United States continued. The clause had not ended slavery, it had merely timed one of its arteries. 23. Before any of those detailed clauses, before the lists of powers and the careful hedges, the Constitution opens with a promise wrapped in serene rhythm. Among the stated purposes of the new government is the aim to ensure domestic tranquility, a phrase that on its surface sounds like a lullaby for a restless country. But behind it lurked recent memories. Veterans unpaid, farmers facing foreclosure, state governments wobbling, and uprisings like Shays's Rebellion in Massachusetts, where armed citizens shut down courts. To some Americans, that unrest looked like justified protest against economic injustice. To many political and economic elites, it looked like the edge of anarchy. Domestic tranquility captured the desire for order, predictability, and a government strong enough to keep internal conflict from spiraling. Critics would later wonder whether that soothing phrase also signaled a willingness to use federal power against popular movements. Like much of the preamble, it was both aspiration and warning. 24. Shays's Rebellion didn't just color a phrase in the preamble, it stalked the entire convention like a recent nightmare. In the winter of 1786 to 1787, Daniel Shays and other distressed farmers in western Massachusetts, many Revolutionary War veterans, organized to stop foreclosures and tax collections they saw as crushing and unfair. They closed courts, clashed with state militia, and briefly made it seem as if a state government could be toppled by its own citizens. Under the Articles of Confederation, the national government had almost no capacity to respond. There was no standing army, no reliable revenue, no clear mechanism for restoring order if a state faltered. For many influential figures, this episode was the smoking gun proving that the existing framework was dangerously weak. When they gathered in Philadelphia, speeches about the need for a stronger central authority referenced Shays's uprising again and again, turning a local protest into a national constitutional turning point. 25. If Shays's Rebellion haunted the delegates like a fresh nightmare, the Annapolis Convention was more like an awkward dress rehearsal that almost nobody showed up for. In September 1786, representatives from only 5 states actually made it to Annapolis, Maryland, despite invitations going out across the Confederation. Officially, the meeting was supposed to tackle problems with interstate commerce, like states slapping tariffs on each other's goods and squabbling over navigation rights. Unofficially, some attendees arrived hoping to open the door to something much bigger than shipping regulations. James Madison and Alexander Hamilton looked around the nearly empty gathering and realized they didn't have the numbers to rewrite anything, but they did have the chance to ask for a do-over. The group drafted a modest-sounding report calling for another convention in Philadelphia to consider further provisions to make the Union effective. That vague phrase became the hinge. A sparsely attended trade conference quietly issued the invitation that led to the Constitution. 26. The reason that small meeting in Annapolis could spark something larger was that everyone could see the Articles of Confederation were buckling under real-world pressure. Under the Articles, Congress could request money from the states but not compel them to pay. which meant funding the national government depended on good moods and voluntary compliance. States often ignored those requests, leaving soldiers unpaid, foreign debts lingering, and basic operations starved of cash. Congress could negotiate treaties, but without enforcement power, it couldn't ensure states actually honored them, which made European powers doubt American reliability. When states started issuing their own paper money, passing debtor relief laws, and wrestling over boundaries and river access, there was no strong, impartial national referee. To some Americans, that loose arrangement looked like healthy local self-rule. To many merchants, creditors, and nationalists, it looked like chaos in slow motion. The Philadelphia Convention emerged as an attempt to patch those cracks before the whole structure split apart. 27. Once the delegates finally gathered in Philadelphia, the biggest immediate crack in that structure was representation, and the small state large state standoff almost broke the convention entirely, until two relatively quiet men from Connecticut stepped in. Larger states like Virginia and Pennsylvania argued that representation in the new Congress should be based on population, reasoning that more people meant more interest to be fairly represented. Smaller states like New Jersey and Delaware feared being permanently outvoted and insisted on equal representation, one state, one vote, as under the Articles. The debates grew tense enough that some delegates seriously talked about walking out. Roger Sherman and Oliver Ellsworth, both experienced in colonial and state politics, proposed a blended solution, a House of Representatives apportioned by population, and a Senate where each state received 2 seats. It wasn't elegant theoretical philosophy. It was a political survival strategy. That Connecticut compromise gave each side enough to stay in the room, and without it, there likely would have been no Constitution to argue over later. 28. While Sherman and Ellsworth were stitching together a middle path, Alexander Hamilton took a very different route. He lit up the room with a marathon speech that mostly went nowhere. In June 1787, Hamilton spoke for hours, praising what he called energetic government and sketching a system that, to some ears, looked alarmingly close to the British model Americans had just fought. He suggested a chief executive and senators elected for life during good behavior, and state governors appointed by the national government, ideas that made many delegates nervous about creeping monarchy. Hamilton's argument wasn't simply that strong power was good. He insisted that human nature and political experience showed weak governments invite disorder and foreign manipulation. But he was already an outlier in his own New York delegation, and many delegates thought his plan politically impossible to ratify even if they agreed with pieces of it. His long oration influenced later Federalist arguments more than the document itself. In Philadelphia, it mostly underscored how far the convention was willing to go and how far it wasn't. 29. Hamilton's marginal position came into sharp focus at the end, when it was time to put names under the parchment and New York's delegation had splintered. The state had sent 3 delegates, Hamilton, Robert Yates, and John Lansing Jr. Yates and Lansing, worried that the convention was exceeding its mandate and building too powerful a central government, left in protest before the work was done. That walkout left Hamilton as the lone New Yorker still in the hall, and under the rules, a state needed at least 2 delegates present to cast its official vote. New York, in a technical sense, never formally approved the Constitution at the convention stage. Yet when the document was engrossed, Hamilton stepped forward and signed anyway, adding his name beneath a heading that still listed New York. His signature was a personal endorsement, not a valid state vote, but it symbolized a deeper shift. In the ratification battles that followed, Hamilton would work furiously through pamphlets and speeches to pull his reluctant state into the new framework he had helped legitimize with that solitary flourish. 30. While Hamilton was talking himself hoarse and Madison was counting every vote, one of the most famous American revolutionaries was watching from across an ocean, sending home commentary like letters from another planet. Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence and later a fierce critic of centralized power, was in Paris serving as the United States Minister to France during the entire Philadelphia Convention. He followed the proceedings through private correspondence, receiving drafts, summaries, and rumors in an age when news crossed the Atlantic at the speed of sail. Jefferson liked the idea of a stronger union than the Articles had provided, but worried about missing elements, especially a Bill of Rights explicitly protecting individual liberties and certain state prerogatives. From his vantage point amid French salons and the early rumblings of another revolution, he sent back famous observations about the need for periodic resistance and the value of divided power. His absence meant one of the new nation's sharpest philosophical voices didn't directly shape the debates in the hall, but his criticism from abroad helped fuel the later push to amend the finished product almost as soon as it was adopted. 31. If Jefferson was peering across the Atlantic with his quill in Paris, John Adams was doing something similar from the other side of the channel, missing the whole show in Philadelphia. Adams had spent years arguing for constitutional government and checks and balances in Massachusetts, even helping shape that state's 1780 Constitution, which was one of the most sophisticated written frameworks of its day. By 1787, though, he was serving as the first American minister to Great Britain, trying to convince former imperial masters that the new United States was a serious, creditworthy country and not just a loose coalition of rebellious colonies. While Madison and company were sweating through arguments about representation and executive power, Adams was writing long treatises like A Defense of the Constitutions of Government of the United States, analyzing political history and European models. He worried about aristocracy, faction, and the corrosive effects of unrestrained democracy, themes that echoed the fears of many delegates back home. But in practical terms, Adams didn't get to propose clauses, lobby in the corners, or count noses before key votes. Instead, his constitutional ideas floated in from London as books and letters, influencing the intellectual climate but not the day-to-day bargaining. The Constitution that emerged was drafted by people who knew his writings, but the man himself, one of the revolution's loudest voices, was physically absent when the actual parchment took shape. 32. One person who was very much in the room, even when he spoke softly, was Benjamin Franklin, whose most famous contribution wasn't a clause, but a plea for humility. Franklin was 81 years old during the convention, frail, carried in a sedan chair, and often too weak to deliver his own remarks, so he had others read them aloud. Near the end of the summer, when tempers were frayed and no one was entirely happy with the final draft, Franklin submitted a speech urging the delegates to doubt their own infallibility. He admitted that parts of the Constitution did not meet his approval, but added that with long experience, he had learned to suspect his own judgment as much as that of others. His message was that no group of imperfect humans could ever produce a perfect government plan, and waiting for perfection meant getting nothing at all. Franklin urged the delegates to set aside their private objections, present a united front, and sign the document for the sake of national stability. Coming from a revered elder statesman who had once charmed French courts and mediated colonial disputes, that call for compromise had moral weight. His speech didn't magically erase disagreements, but it offered a way to live with the flaws, acknowledge they exist, hope future generations will correct them, and agree that an imperfect constitution was better than drifting back into the weakness and division of the Articles. 33. Franklin's age made him an outlier, but his presence also highlighted how generationally mixed the convention really was, a blend of idealistic youth and weathered veterans. James Madison was 36, Alexander Hamilton just 32, and Gouverneur Morris in his mid-30s, part of a cohort that had come of age during the Revolution and saw the Articles' failures up close. These younger delegates were restless, analytical, and ambitious, eager to design systems instead of simply inherit them. On the other end of the spectrum were elders like Franklin, in his 80s, and figures in their 50s and 60s, who had deeper experience with colonial politics, British legal traditions, and the messy realities of governing. They had seen assemblies dissolve into brawls, watched governors clash with elected bodies, and lived through currency crises long before independence. This age mix produced a particular kind of conversation, younger men pushing for bold restructuring, older men warning about human nature, ambition, and unintended consequences. Madison kept meticulous notes not just because he was studious, but because he understood that this moment might never come again, a crossing of generations that could fuse revolutionary energy with institutional memory. The Constitution that emerged reflects this tension, innovative mechanisms like separation of powers and checks and balances paired with a deep suspicion of concentrated authority and sweeping popular passion. It was designed by people who remembered monarchy and imperial rule, but also by men who expected future Americans, not yet born, to test every assumption. 34. One reason we know so much about those generational battles is that they eventually talked, but at the time, they were supposed to stay quiet, and that silence later turned into legend. The convention adopted a formal rule of secrecy early on, instructing delegates not to disclose debates to the public or even to other officials while the work was in progress. The idea was to allow frank discussion without outside pressure from newspapers, state legislatures, or curious foreign observers who might seize on every disagreement as proof the Union was collapsing. Over time, this rule hardened in popular memory into stories about solemn oaths of silence, as if each delegate swore some dramatic vow never to reveal anything. The surviving records don't show a ritual like that. They show a more bureaucratic directive, backed by social norms and mutual interest in avoiding a premature political firestorm. Some delegates did jot down notes, and a few shared private impressions with trusted correspondents, but there was no official, immediate release of transcripts or roll call votes. The secrecy made the Constitution's unveiling in September 1787 feel like a surprise package, sparking suspicion in some quarters that an unelected elite had cooked up a new system behind closed doors. Yet, without that enforced confidentiality, many of the compromises that held the convention together might have collapsed under real-time public outrage long before ink ever touched parchment. 35. The effort to keep things secret wasn't just about rules. It changed the physical atmosphere of the convention, quite literally heating up the room. Stories from the time described the windows of Independence Hall kept shut and the curtains drawn even during a Pennsylvania summer that was hot, humid, and stagnant. The goal was to prevent passers-by from eavesdropping or catching glimpses of notes and draft documents, but the side effect was a stifling chamber where dozens of men sat in heavy 18th century clothing, debating for hours. Later accounts hardened those details into a legend of sealed windows and airless, suffocating meetings, as if the entire Constitution had been forged in a self-imposed sauna. Some historians point out that windows may have been opened at times, and that memories can exaggerate for effect, but no one doubts the conditions were uncomfortable. The heat became part of the mythology, sweaty shirts, damp wigs, and tempers rising along with the temperature. For people who like their founding stories dramatic, the image of delegates arguing about executive power while fanning themselves in a dim, overheated room is irresistible. It symbolized the belief that confidentiality had a physical cost, that the price of keeping the debates inside those walls was measured not just in political capital, but in actual oppressive discomfort. 36. Even with secrecy and shuttered windows, the convention's work didn't proceed in a smooth, steady line. It wobbled whenever enough chairs were empty, and that fragility shaped the final document. Under the rules they adopted, a certain number of states had to be represented for business to count, and within each state delegation there had to be at least a minimal presence to cast its vote. Delegates came and went for personal reasons, illness, business back home, or sheer frustration, and some state delegations were tiny to begin with, so a single absence could change the alignment in the room. This meant that on some days controversial questions got postponed because the right mix of people wasn't present, and on others, slim majorities pushed through resolutions that might have failed if a few more chairs had been occupied. Madison's notes show votes reversing as attendance shifted and alliances hardened or softened over the summer. In a modern system, we tend to imagine major structural choices as the product of broad, stable coalitions, but at Philadelphia, some foundational decisions were made by a handful of men representing a subset of states on a particular afternoon. The Constitution's contours weren't just the result of grand theory and timeless wisdom. They were also the product of missed stagecoaches, sick days, and the basic fact that human bodies can't be in two places at once. 37. By the time the convention wrapped up in September, the famous founding fathers weren't a fixed cast of heroes, but a revolving door of 55 men who showed up, left, came back, or disappeared altogether, reminding us that the Constitution wasn't forged by a perfectly united elite, but by whoever happened to be in the room on a given day. Some delegates, like Madison and Hamilton, stayed for most of the summer, slogging through committee after committee. Others arrived late, missed key compromises, or slipped away when it became clear the final product would not match their instructions from home. A few never really engaged in the deep debates, treating Philadelphia almost like a diplomatic posting, rather than a constitutional boot camp. Several went home in protest when they saw the national government gaining more teeth than they thought safe, fearing their signatures would legitimize something they considered dangerous. That flux meant that different issues were shaped by different combinations of personalities, with no single unchanging group overseeing every decision. The 55 figure sounds stable and impressive, but underneath it was a messy human story of illness, business pressures, political second thoughts, and the simple fatigue that comes from arguing about government day after day in a stifling hall. 38. Out of those 55 who passed through Independence Hall, only 39 actually put pen to parchment on September 17, a number that quietly contradicts the later myth of flawless unanimity. 16 men who had sat in the same room, heard the same speeches, and weighed the same compromises chose not to endorse the final draft, for reasons ranging from principled objection to tactical caution to sheer absence. The role of signers itself was weighted toward certain states and interests, reflecting which delegations had held together and which had splintered by the end. For the new government to look legitimate, the framers knew they needed enough respected names to project unity, even if everyone understood that important voices were missing. Franklin's closing appeal for imperfect consensus helped convince some waverers to sign despite doubts, on the theory that amendments could fix flaws later, but it did not convert all the skeptics. The fact that almost a third of the men who had participated walked away without signing became ammunition for anti-federalists during the ratification fights, proof that even insiders thought the plan went too far. When people speak today about the framers' intent, it's worth remembering that more than a dozen framers essentially said, in writing, that this wasn't their intent at all. 39. Among those holdouts, George Mason of Virginia stands out, not only because he refused to sign, but because his main objection foreshadowed one of the Constitution's most famous later additions, the Bill of Rights. Mason had helped draft the Virginia Declaration of Rights in 1776, a document that spelled out freedoms of press, religion, and due process in explicit terms, so he came to Philadelphia with a strong belief that any new national charter should do the same. As the convention progressed, he watched clauses about structure and power multiply while specific protections for individual liberties remained vague or missing, and his worries deepened. Near the end, he proposed adding a Bill of Rights directly into the Constitution, but the suggestion was brushed aside as unnecessary or too time-consuming, especially with delegates exhausted and eager to go home. Mason read the finished text and concluded that it granted the federal government broad authority without putting clear fences around what it could not do to ordinary citizens. Rather than endorse a framework he feared might invite abuse, he declined to sign and later became a prominent critic during ratification, arguing that liberty needed more than faith and good intentions. His refusal didn't stop the Constitution, but his arguments helped pressure the new Congress into drafting the first 10 amendments that now anchor many Americans' most cherished legal protections. 40. Edmund Randolph's decision not to sign added another twist, because this was the man who had, back in May, introduced the Virginia Plan, the ambitious blueprint that set the convention's agenda. As governor of Virginia and a respected lawyer, Randolph arrived in Philadelphia committed to strengthening the Union, convinced the Articles of Confederation were too weak to hold the states together in the long run. He presented Madison's ideas for a powerful national government with separate branches and a stronger legislature, helping to pull the discussion away from merely patching the old system and toward designing something fundamentally new. But as drafts evolved and compromises accumulated, Randolph grew uneasy about how far the final document went in concentrating power at the center, especially without a Bill of Rights or stricter limits on the executive. He also worried politically. Virginia's voters were divided, and he feared that signing a controversial constitution might leave him isolated at home, branded as someone who had betrayed state sovereignty. In the closing days, he argued for submitting the text to a second convention after state legislatures reviewed it, hoping revisions could soften its sharper edges. When that idea failed, he withheld his signature, choosing a cautious distance instead of full endorsement. Later, after the ratification process added momentum and a Bill of Rights seemed likely, Randolph shifted and supported the new government, an evolution that shows how fluid and tactical some of the framers' positions were. 41. Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts, whose name would later be immortalized in the term gerrymandering, also refused to sign in Philadelphia. driven by a mixture of ideological and procedural worries that he thought the convention had brushed aside too quickly. Jerry had been a vocal supporter of independence and had served in the Continental Congress, but he was deeply suspicious of standing armies, centralized taxation, and what he saw as built-in advantages for the wealthy and well-connected. As the summer wore on, he objected to the lack of a Bill of Rights, the potential for the new Congress to swallow up state authority, and the possibility that the vice president's role in the Senate might mingle executive and legislative power in dangerous ways. He also disliked how the convention had, in his view, outrun its original mandate to revise the articles, essentially scrapping them and designing an entirely new system behind closed doors. When the final document came to a vote, Jerry stood with Mason and Randolph in abstaining, predicting that the plan would either lead to monarchy or to civil war. Yet during the ratification struggle, as it became clear that outright rejection might fracture the Union, Jerry edged toward a more conditional acceptance, arguing that amendments, especially a Bill of Rights, could salvage the project. By the time he later served as James Madison's vice president, he had become part of the very national leadership structure he once distrusted, living out the tension between principle and political reality. 42. All of those tangled debates and reluctant signatures finally condensed into a single physical object, the engrossed Constitution, written out by hand on sheets of prepared animal skin parchment before the delegates lined up to sign. After weeks of revisions, the convention appointed a committee of style, led by Gouverneur Morris, to polish the language and assemble the agreed-upon clauses into a coherent, flowing document with its now famous preamble. Once they settled on the final text, a professional scribe carefully copied it in an elegant, consistent script, mindful that any stray mark or unclear letter could cause legal arguments later about what the framers had actually meant. This clean copy, with its broad margins and neatly ordered articles, was what lay on the table in Independence Hall as delegates added their names beneath the closing attestation clause that began, "Done in convention by the unanimous consent of the states present." The physical act of signing that parchment, dipping quills in ink, committing invisible strokes, transformed months of talk into a tangible authoritative charter that could be carried out of the locked room and into the wider world. Today, people study that same sheet for faded corrections, stylistic flourishes, and the order of signatures, treating it as both a legal instrument and a relic, a reminder that even the most abstract ideas about power and rights must eventually pass through human hands onto something as fragile as skin and ink. 43. If you look closely at that elegant handwriting on the final parchment, you're not seeing Madison's pen or Franklin's shaky signature style expanded across the whole thing. You're almost certainly looking at the work of a relatively anonymous assistant clerk named Jacob Challis, who was brought in to engross the finished text for a modest fee that barely distinguished the job from ordinary office work. Challis worked for the Pennsylvania General Assembly, which met in the same building. So when the convention needed someone skilled with quill, ink, and parchment, they didn't summon a great statesman, they hired the guy down the hall. Historical records suggest he was paid about $30 for the task, a sum that reminds us the physical artifact we now treat as almost sacred scripture was, in practical terms, a rush job done by a government employee on assignment. That means the clean curves of the letters and the careful spacing of the clauses, details later pored over by lawyers and historians, were shaped less by the framer's own hands than by the steady, practiced script of a man whose name never appears in the text he copied. Jacob Challis quietly converted debates, compromises, and political gambles into a single polished document, then slipped back into obscurity while the words he traced went on to define a nation. 44. For all that care with the final parchment, the official record of what actually happened in the room is strangely thin, especially when you compare the formal journal of the convention kept by the Secretary William Jackson to James Madison's sprawling private notes. The journal records motions, votes, and the basic sequence of business, who moved to amend which clause, which states voted aye or nay, but it often skips the arguments that led up to those decisions, leaving whole stretches of the summer looking like a series of dry procedural moves. Madison, by contrast, tried to capture speeches in detail, paraphrasing or reconstructing what delegates said, who clashed with whom, and how ideas evolved over repeated debates. Yet because Jackson's journal is the official document, preserved as the convention's own record, it has a kind of institutional authority that Madison's more revealing narrative doesn't. At some points, the journal is mysteriously quiet or incomplete, with days condensed into a few lines or entire discussions summarized in vague terms, raising questions about what was deliberately omitted and what was simply lost. That gap between the sparse, sanitized official record and the richer, more subjective personal notes means our picture of the convention always has blurred edges, with key moments partly hidden in procedural shadows. When modern readers imagine the framers speaking in clear, definitive sound bites, they're often overlooking just how much of the daily give and take never made it into the government's own book. 45. Madison knew from the start that his notes would be sensitive, and he treated them almost like a political time bomb with a very long fuse, insisting they not be published until after his death. He had promised his fellow delegates a degree of secrecy, so they could argue freely without worrying about immediate public backlash or home state criticism, and he understood that releasing a detailed blow-by-blow account could reignite old fights or give ammunition to ongoing political enemies. So he spent decades revising, organizing, and occasionally polishing the notes while carefully keeping them out of print, even as the Constitution they described became the center of American political life. Only in 1836, after Madison died, did his account finally appear, long after many of the participants and first-generation critics were gone. By then, the Constitution had survived war, party conflict, and multiple crises, so readers approached his notes not as live political dynamite, but as a kind of sacred origin story. That timing gave Madison enormous posthumous influence. His version of events, with his selection of quotations and emphasis on certain debates, helped define how later generations understood the convention's intent. Because rival note-takers' accounts were fragmentary or less accessible, Madison's delayed narrative effectively became the canonical backstage history, shaping court opinions, textbooks, and popular memory, even though it reflected one man's perspective written and edited with decades of hindsight. 46. The framers didn't just write a new government on paper. They also engineered an unusual path for getting it approved, one that deliberately sidestepped the existing state legislatures. Instead of asking those legislatures to ratify the Constitution, the same bodies that might feel their own power threatened, the document itself called for specially elected state conventions, chosen by the people to weigh the plan and either accept or reject it. That was a bold move, because under the Articles of Confederation, any fundamental change was supposed to get unanimous approval from state governments, not from ad hoc popular bodies. The framers were essentially betting that direct appeal to voters, filtered through new conventions, would be more receptive to strengthening the national government than assemblies already invested in the old system. In these ratifying conventions, delegates campaigned, debated publicly, and produced long pamphlets and speeches that laid out both Federalist and anti-Federalist fears in vivid detail. The process turned the Constitution from an elite workshop project into a continent-wide argument about sovereignty, rights, and the meaning of "we the people." When enough states ratified 9 out of 13, as the document itself required, the new framework would go into effect among those ratifying states, even without holdouts, a built-in pressure tactic that made opposition risk isolation. By routing legitimacy through special conventions, the framers tried to ground the Constitution not just in legal technicalities, but in a claim of direct popular authority. 47. To sell that controversial new framework to a skeptical public, 3 Federalist leaders in New York, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, launched an essay campaign under a single shared pen name, Publius. Writing in New York newspapers beginning in 1787, they produced what we now call the Federalist Papers, a rapid-fire series defending the proposed Constitution clause by clause, arguing that a stronger, well-structured central government would actually protect liberty better than the fragile Confederation already wobbling under internal and external pressures. Hamilton wrote the majority of the essays, hammering away at issues like taxation, military power, and the dangers of disunion. Madison contributed some of the most philosophically rich pieces, including Federalist Number 10 on factions and Number 51 on checks and balances, Jay, limited by illness, focused on foreign policy and the need for national unity in the face of European empires. Publishing under Publius let them present a united intellectual front and kept readers focused on the arguments instead of personalities or regional rivalries. At the time, the essays were partisan persuasion tools aimed at winning over New York's ratifying convention. Only later did they acquire an almost constitutional commentary status, treated by judges and scholars as a privileged window into how some framers hoped the new system would work. Yet even then, they represented one side in a fierce debate, not a unanimous explanation endorsed by everyone who had shaped or signed the document. 48. The Constitution's defenders weren't the only ones with a flair for classical aliases. Its critics also cloaked themselves in ancient Roman names as they warned that the proposed structure concentrated too much power at the center. Under signatures like Brutus, Cato, Sentinel, and Federal Farmer, anti-federalist writers argued that a large republic would inevitably swallow local self-government, that the necessary and proper clause in broad taxing authority would invite abuse, and that the lack of a Bill of Rights left ordinary citizens dangerously exposed. These pen names weren't random. Brutus had assassinated Julius Caesar in the name of saving the republic. Cato symbolized republican virtue resisting tyranny, so each carried a pointed message about how the authors saw themselves and the stakes of the moment. Writing from newspapers and pamphlet presses across several states, they reached readers who feared distant rulers as much in Philadelphia as they once had in London. Many of their predictions focused on standing armies, federal courts overshadowing state judiciaries, and the risk that a powerful executive could drift toward monarchy, themes that resonated with people who had just fought a war against a king. Although the Anti-Federalists ultimately lost the battle over ratification, their writings helped fuel the demand for a Bill of Rights and left behind a rich, skeptical commentary tradition that later generations would rediscover whenever central authority seemed to be stretching its bounds. 49. When the ratification campaign finally left the realm of theory and hit actual voting halls, Delaware moved with almost startling speed, seizing the chance not just to approve the new framework, but to carve out a proud little niche in constitutional lore by becoming the first state to say yes. Its convention met in December 1787, only a few months after the final parchment left Philadelphia, and delegates representing a small, vulnerable coastal state that had always worried about being squeezed between bigger neighbors barely hesitated before acting unanimously. From Delaware's perspective, a stronger national government offering protection for commerce along the Delaware River and clearer rules about interstate disputes looked less like a threat and more like a lifeline, especially compared to the loose, sometimes chaotic arrangements under the Articles of Confederation. So the vote was quick, tidy, and decisive, with no recorded organized opposition, allowing Delaware to brand itself the first state, a piece of marketing that later generations would put on license plates and tourist brochures. In a process remembered for drama and knife-edge margins elsewhere, Delaware's clean, enthusiastic ratification stands out as a moment when the new Constitution felt like an obvious upgrade rather than a terrifying experiment. 50. The framers had written their own victory condition into Article 7, calmly declaring that the Constitution would go into effect once 9 of the 13 states ratified, even if the others stayed out for a while, and that self-conscious rule turned New Hampshire's convention into a kind of constitutional countdown clock. By the summer of 1788, 8 states were already on board, but important holdouts like Virginia and New York were still debating, and the mood in New Hampshire had been divided enough earlier that its convention initially paused rather than risk a flat rejection. Federalists worked between sessions, circulating arguments, stressing both the promised amendments and the danger of being left outside a new commercial and political union if they waited too long. When the delegates reconvened and finally voted to ratify on June 21, New Hampshire became the 9th state, technically triggering the Constitution's own mechanism for coming into legal existence among the ratifying states. That meant the document shifted, almost overnight, from a proposal to an operative blueprint. Congress would now have to arrange elections under the new rules, even as remaining states argued about whether to climb aboard. New Hampshire, a relatively small and often overlooked state, thus played the role of constitutional switch flipper, the one whose yes moved the system from hypothetical to real. 51. If Delaware's convention was a calm nod and New Hampshire's was a countdown, Virginia's ratification battle looked more like an extended courtroom drama starring a cast of future household names, all arguing within the same walls. James Madison, slight and methodical, led the Federalist defense of the Constitution, insisting that its checks and balances would curb both majority passions and government overreach. Opposite him stood Patrick Henry, thunderous and suspicious, warning that the new structure smelled too much like the consolidated power Virginians had just escaped in the Revolution. Alongside them, Edmund Randolph wrestled publicly with his shift from refusing to sign in Philadelphia to supporting ratification at home, while a young John Marshall, not yet the towering Chief Justice he would become, quietly backed Madison's arguments with lawyerly precision. The debate stretched on for weeks in the Richmond Convention, spilling into newspapers and tavern talk as ordinary Virginians weighed fears of distant authority against hopes for a more stable union and better economic prospects. In the end, the vote was close, 89 to 79, a razor-thin margin for such a large, influential state, and it came with a political price. Virginia ratified while also recommending a Bill of Rights and other amendments. That compromise let Federalists claim victory, while giving anti-Federalists a path to keep pressing for explicit protections, turning Virginia's hard-fought decision into both an endorsement of the new frame and a lever for reshaping it. 52. New York's path to ratification unfolded under a kind of geographic and psychological squeeze, caught between fierce local anti-Federalist sentiment and the reality that neighboring states were already signing on to the new system. Upstate and rural delegates worried that a distant federal government, headquartered who knew where, would privilege merchants and city interests over farmers, while many New Yorkers resented the idea of surrendering control over trade and taxation to a central authority that might be dominated by other regions. Alexander Hamilton, whose pen had been furiously at work in the Federalist Papers, now had to translate those printed arguments into live persuasion inside the Poughkeepsie Convention Hall, facing opponents who cited the very size and ambition of the proposed government as reasons to reject it outright. As the weeks dragged on, news arrived that Virginia had ratified, meaning that if New York stayed out, it risked being surrounded by states inside a new union, while it remained outside, an uncomfortable prospect for a commercial hub dependent on regional trade. That strategic isolation argument, combined with promises to push for amendments and a Bill of Rights after joining, slowly peeled away enough skeptics to secure ratification by a narrow margin, 30 votes to 27. New York entered the Union not with Delaware-style enthusiasm but with a wary, conditional acceptance, a reminder that even one of the Constitution's most eloquent public defenders had to win his home state by inches rather than miles. 53. North Carolina's relationship with the proposed Constitution began with a firm, almost stubborn "not yet," a stance that underscored just how unsettled many Americans felt about adopting a powerful central government without explicit safeguards. When delegates gathered at the Hillsborough Convention in 1788, anti-Federalists dominated the proceedings, voicing deep anxieties about federal taxation, standing armies, and especially the absence of a Bill of Rights spelling out protections for speech, religion, jury trials, and other liberties. Rather than simply voting the Constitution up or down, the convention chose an unusual middle path. They neither ratified nor outright rejected it, instead adopting a Declaration of Rights and proposed amendments while withholding formal approval. This move effectively kept North Carolina outside the new federal structure even as other states moved ahead, meaning it would not participate in the first round of congressional and presidential elections under the Constitution. Over the next year, however, political winds shifted as the first Congress proposed what would become the Bill of Rights, addressing many of the very concerns that had driven the state's hesitation. With those amendments in motion, a new convention met in Fayetteville in 1789 and finally ratified, bringing North Carolina into the fold with a sense that its early resistance had helped force the country to spell out core freedoms. Its initial refusal thus functioned less as pure obstruction and more as leverage, pushing the emerging national government to put promises about rights into written, enforceable language. 54. Rhode Island, meanwhile, turned hesitation into an art form, earning a reputation as the stubborn holdout that watched almost everyone else board the constitutional train before grudgingly buying a ticket. Suspicious of centralized authority and deeply attached to its tradition of local autonomy and broad religious freedom, the tiny state had refused even to send delegates to the Philadelphia Convention, effectively sitting out the drafting stage and then balking repeatedly when ratification came up at home. At one point, Rhode Island tried to submit proposed constitutional changes directly to the Confederation Congress via popular referendums, a move the other states largely ignored, and its legislature faced growing irritation from merchants and neighbors who feared that the state staying outside the new union would disrupt trade and invite retaliatory measures. Pressure mounted as the federal government under the Constitution actually began operating, imposing tariffs, and organizing institutions that did not quite know how to deal with a lone, non-ratifying outlier, still technically under the old Articles framework. Congress eventually hinted at punitive economic steps, and local economic anxiety combined with political fatigue nudged Rhode Island toward a decision. In May 1790, nearly 3 years after the convention in Philadelphia had adjourned, the state finally ratified by a margin of just 2 votes, becoming the 13th and last of the original states to join. Its belated entry closed the circle of the original Union, but also left behind a cautionary story about how fear of distant power, however understandable, can collide with the practical realities of living in a networked political and economic world. 55. Patrick Henry never set foot in the Philadelphia Convention, but his shadow hung over the ratification fight like a storm cloud, because once the document left that locked hall and hit Virginia soil, he became its loudest, fiercest, and most effective critic. Henry said he had smelt a rat in Philadelphia and deliberately stayed away, convinced that the delegates would use secrecy and elite influence to replace the loose Confederation with something dangerously close to consolidated national power. In the Virginia Convention, he unleashed his courtroom style on the text, turning clauses into warnings. The necessary and proper clause became a blank check, the power to tax became a weapon, the supremacy clause looked like a noose around state authority. Unlike some anti-federalists, Henry wasn't against union itself. He insisted he wanted a safer, more clearly limited version, with a Bill of Rights nailed to the front. His arguments didn't stop ratification, but they helped transform unease into organized opposition, giving anti-federalist concerns about liberty, distance, and concentrated power a passionate voice that federal supporters couldn't ignore. 56. With men like Patrick Henry thundering against the Constitution and narrow margins in key states, Federalists discovered that abstract talk of checks and balances wasn't enough. They needed a political pressure valve, and that valve became the promise of future amendments. In convention after convention, especially in big divided states like Virginia, New York, and Massachusetts, pro-Constitution speakers reassured anxious delegates that adopting the framework did not mean freezing it forever. They argued that once the new government was running, it could correct its own defects, and they sweetened the pitch by explicitly endorsing the idea of adding a Bill of Rights as one of the first orders of business. This promise turned up in ratification resolutions, in newspaper essays, and in private letters, where Federalists made it clear they saw no dishonor in revising the document to calm public fears. That strategy worked. Cautious delegates could vote yes while telling their constituents they had not surrendered principle, only chosen to seek protections through amendment rather than outright rejection. 57. When the first federal Congress convened in 1789, it faced a quiet but very real legitimacy test. Would it treat those ratification promises about rights as serious commitments or disposable campaign talk? James Madison, who had originally doubted the necessity of a Bill of Rights, surprised some colleagues by stepping forward as its chief shepherd, arguing that honoring the state's recommendations would help reconcile all parties to the new system and pull lingering anti-federalist energy into constructive channels. He combed through the long lists of suggested amendments sent by state conventions, boiling down overlapping proposals into a more manageable set that focused on core liberties and structural guarantees. Some representatives grumbled that revisiting the text so soon would make the government look weak, but Madison insisted that refusing to address rights would be far worse, feeding suspicion that Federalists had tricked the country. Bit by bit, the House and Senate hammered out language, merging, trimming, and rephrasing until they had a package they could send to the states, turning campaign rhetoric into concrete constitutional text instead of letting it evaporate. 58. The result of that First Amendment project wasn't the neat list of 10 that school posters and pocket constitutions like to display. It was a bundle of 12 distinct proposals that Congress approved and dispatched to the state legislatures in September 1789. They were arranged in a different order from the modern Bill of Rights, starting with structural issues and then moving to familiar protections like speech, religion, arms, and jury trials. The states then took up each article separately, deciding whether to ratify it on its own merits, which meant the package did not have to rise or fall as an all-or-nothing deal. Over time, 10 of the 12 crossed the required 3/4 threshold and slid into history as the Bill of Rights, while 2 quietly stalled. In the public mind, the 10 that made it became the face of American liberty, but the original 12 remind us that even the most iconic parts of the Constitution emerged through a process of selection hesitation, and partial acceptance rather than automatic consensus. 59. One of those orphaned ideas, the original First Amendment in Congress's 1789 list, didn't protect speech or religion or assembly at all. It tackled a drier question that the framers still considered crucial: how many people each member of the House of Representatives should serve as the population grew. The article laid out a formula that would have steadily expanded the House as the nation's numbers increased, trying to keep representatives close enough to their constituents that they wouldn't drift into becoming a remote political class. A number of states ratified it, but not enough to meet the constitutional threshold. And over time it slipped from public debate as the House settled on a fixed size instead of perpetually ballooning. Today, with each representative serving hundreds of thousands of people, some critics argue that the spirit behind that forgotten amendment still haunts discussions about representation and political distance. It technically remains pending business, with no ratification deadline written into its text. A strange, half-visible relic of the founding generation's worries about scale and democratic intimacy. 60. The other amendment left hanging from 1789 took an even stranger path, drifting through American history, like constitutional space junk for more than 2 centuries before suddenly snapping into orbit as the 27th Amendment. This proposal said, in simple terms, that any law-changing congressional pay could not take effect until after the next House election, ensuring that members would have to face voters before enjoying any salary increase they voted themselves. A handful of states approved it in the early years, but not nearly enough, and it might have stayed forgotten had a college student in the 1980s not stumbled onto it and launched a personal campaign to push modern legislatures to ratify. Because the original text carried no expiration date, each new ratification counted, and slowly the tally crept upward until, in 1992, Michigan's approval tipped it over the constitutional 3/4 mark. What had begun as a small, largely ignored anti-corruption measure from the first Congress thus became, after the longest ratification saga in American history, a late-arriving reminder that the amendment process can be as patient and as unpredictable as the people who use it. 61. The 10th Amendment, which sits quietly at the end of the Bill of Rights, looks like a throwaway line until you remember the political anxiety humming through the 1780s like background noise. Many people who had just thrown off a distant empire were not eager to trade it for a distant national capital, and state politicians in particular feared that the new federal government would slowly swallow their authority clause by clause. The 10th tried to soothe that fear in 17 spare words, declaring that any powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited to the states, were reserved to the states respectively or to the people. It didn't list specific subjects, it didn't draw bright borders, it simply marked the outer shell of federal authority and said, everything beyond this is not automatically Washington's. Supporters treated it as a reassurance, not a revolution, insisting it added nothing new but restated the obvious, while critics hoped it would act like a legal sandbag wall against future expansions of national power. Over time, courts and politicians have fought over how much weight those few words actually carry. But for early skeptics, just seeing them on the page made ratification a little easier to swallow. 62. If the 10th Amendment tried to calm nerves by drawing a vague line around federal power, the 9th Amendment tried to calm a different fear, that putting rights into a list might accidentally shrink liberty instead of protecting it. Some anti-federalists worried that if you wrote down freedoms like speech, religion, and jury trial, clever officials could later argue that anything not specifically named had been left on the cutting room floor. Madison and others responded with the 9th, a kind of legal wink that says, in essence, just because a right isn't written here doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Its full text is a single, cryptic sentence about how the enumeration of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people, and that brevity has made it one of the most debated lines in the Constitution. Is it a reminder not to read the list too narrowly, or an open invitation to courts to recognize unenumerated rights like privacy, bodily autonomy, or parental control? Different judges and scholars have answered that question in sharply different ways, from treating the 9th as little more than a footnote to treating it as a quiet doorway through which modern rights claims can walk. Whatever view you take, the amendment stands as an admission from the founding generation that they knew they hadn't, and couldn't, capture every dimension of human freedom on a single piece of parchment. 63. Even the first words a president speaks under the new Constitution turned out to be more complicated than the framers might have expected, because Americans almost immediately started arguing about how literally to follow the text. Article 2 lays out a specific oath for the president to faithfully execute the office and preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, and some early commentators believed that any deviation from this precise language would be improper or even unconstitutional. But politics and piety tugged in a different direction, as public ceremonies and personal convictions encouraged presidents to dress the oath up with extra flourishes that felt emotionally satisfying if not legally required. The most famous of these is the phrase, "So help me God," which later tradition claims George Washington added on his own, though historians still debate whether that story is memory, myth, or some blend of both. Over the years, presidents have also experimented with adding words before or after the required text, or taking the oath with a mild stumble that had to be corrected on the spot, sparking occasional questions about whether the first attempt counted. Underneath those small controversies lies a recurring tension between a written, secular formula crafted by lawyers and the messy, symbolic expectations of a public that often wants the oath to sound more like a prayer, a speech, or a moral pledge than a bare constitutional recitation. 64. For all the urgency packed into the Constitution's pages, the new government it outlined did not spring into existence overnight. It arrived with the slow, lumbering pace of 18th century logistics. After the ninth state ratified, the document declared that it would go into effect for those approving states, but actually electing a president, senators, and representatives turned out to be a multi-month project involving scattered polling places, handwritten ballots, and long rides over bad roads. The first federal election stretched across winter, and then the people chosen had to physically get themselves to New York City, the temporary capital, which for some meant weeks on horseback, in carriages, or on coastal vessels. Congress was supposed to convene on March 4, 1789, but when the date arrived, too few members had arrived to form a quorum, so the official opening of the new legislature slipped into April as stragglers trickled in. Only once enough representatives and senators were finally seated could they count electoral votes and confirm George Washington's election, triggering yet another delay while messengers rode out to Mount Vernon to tell him and escort him back. That drawn-out start, full of empty chairs and postponed sessions, underscored how the elegant machinery drawn in Philadelphia still depended on the slow, physical movement of actual human beings, and how even a revolution in government had to respect the limits of distance, weather, and time. 65. While all this was unfolding, another unresolved question hovered over the young system like a floating capital city no one had pinned to the map: where, exactly, should the national government live? The Constitution had sidestepped that fight in Philadelphia by talking about a federal district in the abstract without choosing a specific site, leaving the issue for future politicians to hash out in the new Congress. Major states like Pennsylvania, New York, and Virginia all had strong opinions, with local boosters envisioning the prestige and economic benefits that would come from hosting the capital, while skeptics warned that allowing the government to sit in any one powerful state city would only magnify that state's influence. Regional suspicion layered on top of this, as Northerners and Southerners each worried about being forced to trek to a hostile or unfamiliar environment to petition their rulers. The debate eventually intertwined with thorny financial questions, especially Alexander Hamilton's plan for the federal government to assume state Revolutionary War debts, creating a famous bargain in which capital location and fiscal policy were traded like pieces in the same high-stakes game. Until that compromise gelled, however, the capital question remained a pressure point, reminding everyone that the Constitution had not, and probably could not, predetermine every politically explosive detail of how the new order would actually take shape on the ground. 66. Out of that unresolved struggle over location grew one of the document's more unusual structural choices: the decision to create a federal district that would belong to the nation, but not to any state. Article I's District Clause empowers Congress to exercise exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever, over a district up to 10 miles square, carved out with the consent of the affected states, as well as over federal forts, dockyards, and similar enclaves. The idea was to prevent the national government from being physically and politically dependent on a single state, as had happened under the Articles when Pennsylvania's reluctance to confront mutinous soldiers left Congress feeling vulnerable in Philadelphia. By giving Congress full authority over the capital's police, streets, and basic governance, The framers hoped to ensure that no state militia, tax system, or local legislature could hold the federal government hostage or tilt national policy through sheer geographic leverage. In practice, this created a peculiar status for the people who would eventually live in that district, who paid federal taxes and fought in federal wars but initially had no voting representation in Congress and no say in presidential elections. The District Clause thus solved one 18th century problem: state dominance over the capital, while planting a new, long-running debate over how much democratic voice residents of the national city should have in the very government that surrounds them. 67. Tucked quietly into Article I and Article II are two nearly forgotten speed bumps for ambition called the emoluments clauses, which sound like something to do with ointment but actually deal with money and favors. The Foreign Emoluments Clause bars anyone holding an office under the United States from accepting any present, emolument, office, or title from a king, prince, or foreign state without Congress's consent, a sentence that reads like a long suspicious side-eye cast toward the glittering courts of Europe. The Domestic Emoluments Clause, aimed just at the president, freezes his salary during his term and forbids taking any other emolument from the United States or any individual state, like a preemptive warning not to treat the presidency as a side hustle. The framers had watched ministers and monarchs use gifts, pensions, and honorary titles to bend foreign officials to their will, and they were determined that American officers wouldn't quietly become pensioners of Paris or London. For a long time, these clauses sat mostly in the background, invoked occasionally when an ambassador received a jeweled snuff box or a medal, but modern lawsuits over presidents owning hotels, golf courses, and sprawling business empires revived the question of what counts as an emolument in a capitalism-soaked world. Courts and scholars now argue about whether the term covers any profit, only payments tied directly to office, or something in between, yet behind the semantic trench warfare sits a simple anxiety that hasn't aged a day. If foreign or domestic governments can discreetly pour money into an officeholder's hands, how long before public duty starts answering to private invoices instead? 68. That same suspicion of power dressed in fine clothes and flattering words shows up in another small but potent constitutional phrase: the Senate shall give its advice and consent on treaties and major appointments. On paper, this formula looks almost polite, like the president is merely asking a panel of elder statesmen for their thoughts before hiring someone or signing a deal. But in practice, it turned the Senate into a kind of constitutional bouncer standing between the executive branch and the rest of the world. The framers did not trust one person, no matter how virtuous, to pick ambassadors, judges, or cabinet officers alone, especially when those officials could shape foreign alliances or domestic law for decades after the president had left office. They also remembered how European monarchs had secretly traded away territory and obligations in smoky back rooms, so they wanted treaties, those solemn promises binding the entire nation, to pass through a second filter before becoming law. Over time, the Senate has wielded this power aggressively or passively depending on the era, sometimes rubber-stamping nominations with barely a whisper, sometimes turning confirmation hearings into gladiatorial spectacles where ideology, scandal, and personal grudges collide. Treaties have suffered similar fates. Some, like NATO, cleared the chamber with overwhelming bipartisan support. Others, like the League of Nations Pact after World War I, died loudly on the floor as senators insisted they were protecting American sovereignty. The advice and consent requirement doesn't guarantee wise choices, but it ensures that when things go sideways, more than one branch of government owns the decision. 69. If advice and consent were designed to keep bad decisions from entering the system in the first place, impeachment was built as the emergency exit you hope never to use but keep within arm's reach anyway. The framers had just declared independence from a king who, in their view, treated power as a personal inheritance, and they weren't about to create a new office called president without a clear way to eject someone who abused it. Still, they wanted this ejection mechanism to be political, not criminal, about defending the constitutional order rather than simply punishing ordinary lawbreaking, so they anchored impeachment to the elusive phrase treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. That last category has caused arguments ever since, because it doesn't map neatly onto criminal codes. It gestures instead at serious betrayals of public trust, the kind that might technically be legal but still corrode the system from within. Congress split the job in two, giving the House the power to impeach, like a grand jury issuing charges, and the Senate the power to try those charges and, if convicted, remove the official and possibly disqualify them from future office. Presidents have drawn most of the headlines, but judges have actually been impeached and removed more often, usually for corruption, drunkenness, or outright refusal to do their jobs. Each impeachment leaves behind a paper trail of arguments about what misconduct crosses the constitutional line, making the mechanism as much a mirror of each generation's political morality as a fixed legal device. 70. Buried in the bland eligibility checklist for the presidency is a phrase that has launched more debates, lawsuits, and late-night theories than its few words seem to justify: the requirement that the president be a natural-born citizen. The framers didn't pause long in Philadelphia to define that term, probably because they assumed everyone knew what it meant, or because they were more focused on avoiding a scenario where some charismatic European nobleman sailed over and charmed his way into the new republic's highest office. Many scholars think the phrase was essentially a belt and suspenders way of saying the commander-in-chief should owe his first and deepest allegiance to the United States, not to some old homeland that might still claim his loyalty. In practice, the requirement has generally been understood to include people born on American soil and those born abroad to American parents, but edge cases like children adopted from overseas, people born in territories that later became states, or candidates with dual citizenship have kept the definition from ever fully settling. Modern politics has weaponized the ambiguity at times, with opponents questioning the natural-born status of various candidates, from Chester Arthur in the 19th century to Barack Obama, John McCain, and Ted Cruz in the 21st. Courts have mostly sidestepped issuing sweeping rulings, leaving the phrase half-lit by historical practice and half-shadowed by continuing controversy, an old, underexplained line that still quietly shapes who can even enter the presidential lottery. 71. If the presidency's eligibility clause hints at anxieties about who might lead the nation, the Constitution's requirement for a periodic census reflects a different kind of worry: how to divide power fairly when people keep moving and multiplying. Article I mandates an actual enumeration of the population within 3 years of the first Congress and every 10 years thereafter. A surprisingly bureaucratic sentence for a document better known for grander phrases. The framers had lived under apportionment schemes that froze representation based on outdated assumptions or political compromise, and they wanted the new House to respond, at least roughly, to real population shifts rather than to some permanent guess etched into parchment. Tying representation, and later direct taxes, to a recurring headcount also forced the government to look the country in the face every decade, to ask intrusive questions about households, occupations, and identities that reveal who is actually living under the flag. From the start, the census was entangled with injustice as well as fairness. Enslaved people counted as 3/5 for representation, Native Americans were mostly excluded, and free black people were often undercounted or ignored. Over time, the enumeration has grown more detailed and more controversial, with fights over racial categories, privacy, citizenship questions, and which communities get missed when census workers knock on doors. Yet beneath the shifting forms and political battles, the 10-year rhythm continues, quietly recalibrating how many voices each state sends to Congress and how billions of dollars in federal money get sliced up, a reminder that even lofty constitutional structures rest on the simple act of counting bodies. 72. Right alongside those counting rules, the framers left a smaller, almost fussy instruction about where certain kinds of laws have to begin, a rule that only makes sense if you remember just how much they distrusted taxation without close supervision. The origination clause says that all bills for raising revenue shall originate in the House of Representatives, a nod to the idea that the legislative body closest to the voters should hold the initiatory pen when it comes to reaching into people's wallets. This copied British practice, where the elected House of Commons claimed the exclusive right to start money bills, leaving the aristocratic House of Lords mostly to accept, reject, or tinker at the edges. In the American version, the Senate is allowed to propose or concur with amendments as on other bills, which pretty quickly turned into senators gutting House revenue bills and inserting their own text, then sending the stitched-together creature back down the hall. That habit has sparked recurring grumbles in the House and occasional court challenges about what counts as a genuine bill for raising revenue versus a spending measure or regulatory scheme with incidental financial effects. Courts have generally taken a relatively narrow view, treating the clause as relevant mainly for laws whose primary purpose is to bring money into the Treasury, not for every statute that happens to touch dollars. Still, the origination clause stands as a quiet, procedural echo of a revolution that began over taxes, a structural reminder that when the government comes for your money, The first move is supposed to belong to the chamber you can throw out every 2 years. 73. The treaty power tension. Delegates split over who should control foreign policy, producing a shared treaty process. From the moment they started talking about foreign affairs, the delegates were spooked by two opposite nightmares: a single president secretly selling the country out in some candlelit European palace, and a sprawling legislature so slow and quarrelsome that it couldn't respond to danger until British cannon were already in the harbor. Under the Articles of Confederation, Congress technically handled treaties, but negotiating by committee had proved clumsy and often embarrassing, and foreign powers didn't know whom to take seriously. So in Philadelphia, some wanted to hand treaty-making entirely to the executive for speed and secrecy, while others insisted only the people's representatives should be able to bind the nation's honor. The compromise parked negotiation and signature with the president, but locked in the Senate as co-owner of the final decision, requiring a two-thirds vote to turn any deal into law. The House was conspicuously left out, a slight it never forgot, which is why later fights over trade agreements, executive agreements, and war powers keep circling this uneasy middle ground. Who actually speaks for the United States when it makes promises that outlive any one administration? 74. The pardon power. The president received broad pardon authority, except in cases of impeachment. Tucked into Article 2 is a power that sounds almost medieval in its sweep. The president shall have power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment. The framers borrowed the idea from English kings but tried to tame it, not by narrowing the types of crimes. Federal offenses were fair game, but by making its holder elected and time-limited, someone who, at least in theory, answered to the public rather than divine right. Alexander Hamilton argued that mercy needed to be flexible and fast, especially after rebellions or during national crises, when a well-timed pardon might calm a region or heal a political wound better than more hangings ever could. Others worried it would become a shield for cronies, a get-out-of-jail-free card for allies who broke the law on a president's behalf, or even a way for a president to dangle clemency as hush money. The impeachment exception was the one bright red line everyone agreed on. You could not short-circuit Congress's ultimate check on misbehavior in office by simply waving the royal wand of forgiveness over yourself or your friends. Ever since, the pardon power has been a Rorschach test for presidential character, producing acts of moving clemency, naked favoritism, controversial mass amnesties, and recurring arguments over whether a president can pardon himself, a question the Constitution pointedly never answers. 75. The recess appointment tool. This clause anticipated long breaks in government when travel and communication were slow. In a world without airplanes, email, or even reliable roads, the framers knew the Senate would sometimes vanish back to distant home states for months, leaving vacancies in key offices that couldn't wait until spring thaw. To prevent the machinery of government from grinding to a halt every time a judge died or an ambassador resigned mid-session, they tucked in the recess appointments clause, letting the president temporarily fill positions when the Senate was not in session, with those commissions expiring at the end of the next Senate term. At the time, this seemed like a practical patch, not a political weapon, because recess meant real physical absence and slow communication, not today's pro forma sessions where senators gavel in for 30 seconds to avoid technically being gone. As the calendar of Congress changed and partisanship sharpened, presidents began using recess appointments as a way around Senate obstruction, installing controversial nominees who couldn't win confirmation, while the Senate responded by redefining what counted as a recess to shrink the window for such maneuvers. The Supreme Court eventually stepped in, saying, in essence, that you can't call something a recess if the Senate is technically still around, even if everyone's on vacation. But the deeper tension remains the same as in 1787. How much unilateral staffing power should a president have when the other branch decides, for political reasons, to stall the confirmation line? 76. The Guarantee Clause. The United States promised every state a Republican form of government, though the phrase stayed vague. Nestled almost casually in Article 4 is a promise that sounds grand and reassuring but quickly dissolves when you press it. The United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a Republican form of government. The delegates wanted to make sure no state backslid into monarchy or handed power to a hereditary aristocracy, and they were also quietly signaling to the world that this experimental federation wouldn't tolerate little internal kingdoms popping up like mushrooms after rain. But they never defined Republican with any precision. Was it about elected representatives, broad suffrage, protection of minority rights, or simply the absence of a crown? Early on, the clause was invoked in high drama, like during the Dorr Rebellion in Rhode Island, when competing governments each claimed they were the real Republican authority and begged Washington to take sides. The Supreme Court used those episodes to declare the Guarantee Clause largely a political question, meaning courts wouldn't use it as a yardstick to measure whether a state's constitution was democratic enough. That hands-off approach left the clause more as a background principle than a sharp legal tool, invoked rhetorically in debates over Reconstruction, voting rights, and gerrymandering, but rarely decisive on its own. In practice, it became a vague umbrella under which the federal government could justify intervention or carefully avoid it, whenever a state's internal politics threatened to drift too far from the national ideal of self-government. 77. The militia clauses, shared militia powers, reflected fears of standing armies and dependence on citizen soldiers. When the framers turned to questions of defense, they were haunted by two overlapping nightmares: a permanent standing army that could morph into an instrument of domestic tyranny, and a patchwork of unreliable state militias that might melt away at the first sign of real danger. Their answer, at least on paper, was to split the difference through what became known as the militia clauses, giving Congress power to organize, arm, and discipline the militias, while reserving to the states the appointment of officers and day-to-day training. The federal government could call these citizen soldiers into national service to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions, a phrase written with fresh memories of Shays' Rebellion and lingering fears of British return. This arrangement assumed that ordinary male citizens would periodically muster, drill on village greens, and be ready to pick up their muskets when the Republic called, making military force less a separate professional caste and more an extension of the people themselves. Over time, industrial war, global commitments, and professionalized forces strained that vision, and Congress gradually transformed the militia into the modern National Guard, a hybrid force that can be toggled between state and federal control. Legal fights over when Washington can federalize the Guard, and political arguments about using troops for domestic law enforcement, still echo the original anxiety threading those clauses: how to arm the government strongly enough to defend itself without also handing it the very tools that could strangle liberty. 78. The ban on titles of nobility. The Constitution barred aristocratic titles to distance the Republic from inherited privilege. After breaking with a king, the framers were in no mood to watch their new officials start sprouting lords, dukes, or barons in front of their names like decorative fungi, so they wrote a blunt rule: no titles of nobility, either from the United States or accepted from foreign powers without Congress's consent. This was less about petty jealousy and more about trying to kill, at the root, the old European habit of turning government service into a pipeline for hereditary rank and social caste. They had seen how ribbons, orders, and honorifics could quietly bind politicians' loyalties to monarchs, and how entrenched aristocracies could warp lawmaking in favor of their own estates for generations. By banning domestic titles and tightly controlling foreign ones, they hoped to keep public honor tied to offices and achievements rather than bloodlines, and to avoid the subtle political gravity that comes with calling someone Count so-and-so on the floor of Congress. The rule didn't stop Americans from mimicking aristocratic style in other ways, building family dynasties, amassing fortunes, and naming things after themselves, but it drew a bright symbolic line that law could actually enforce. Today, the clause surfaces occasionally in quirky lawsuits or debates over honorary knighthoods given to American celebrities, yet its core message remains stubbornly clear. In theory, at least, the Constitution recognizes citizens, not nobles, and public power is not supposed to come with a hereditary label attached. 79. The Contract Clause. States were forbidden to impair contracts, a response to post-war economic instability. In the economic chaos after the Revolution, state legislatures had become laboratories of panic, debt relief, and creative cheating. Farmers and small debtors, squeezed by hard times and tight credit, begged their representatives to pass laws delaying payments, canceling obligations, or letting people pay back debts in cheap paper money instead of scarce gold and silver. Many states obliged, sometimes wiping out contracts retroactively, sometimes tilting the playing field so hard that creditors watched their legal rights simply dissolve. To merchants, investors, and anyone trying to do business across state lines, this wasn't democratic compassion, it was financial anarchy. So in Article I, the framers slipped in a blunt restriction: no state shall pass any law impairing the obligation of contracts. On paper, they were protecting private agreements from sudden political whims, reassuring creditors that deals would be honored. In practice, they were also quietly yanking a powerful tool away from future hard-pressed legislatures, locking in a more creditor-friendly constitutional order that made it much harder for states to experiment with aggressive debt relief when the next crisis hit. 80. The full faith and credit clause. States were required to respect one another's public acts, records, and judicial proceedings. Under the Articles of Confederation, the states behaved less like pieces of a single nation and more like mildly hostile neighbors, each with its own rules, courts, and grudges. A divorce granted in one state might be ignored in another. A debt judgment could evaporate if the debtor simply crossed a river. Even basic records like marriage or property titles might not be honored once you crossed a state line. The framers knew that if contracts, court decisions, and legal statuses dissolved at every border, the United States would be a slogan, not a functioning union. So they wrote the full faith and credit clause, instructing each state to give legal respect to the public acts, records, and judicial proceedings of every other. They left Congress power to specify the details, which it later used to create rules about how judgments travel and how records must be authenticated. Over time, the clause became a quiet workhorse of national life, making it possible to move, marry, divorce, own property, and sue people across state lines without having your legal identity reset every time you crossed a bridge. And in modern debates over same-sex marriage, parental rights, or civil judgments, it keeps resurfacing as a constitutional reminder that, however different their politics, the states are not supposed to treat each other as foreign countries. 81. The Privileges and Immunities Clause. This clause sought to prevent states from treating out-of-state citizens as complete outsiders. The framers had just fought a war together, but the states still carried deep suspicions and petty rivalries, especially when it came to economic advantage. Some states tried to favor their own residents by taxing outsiders more heavily, blocking them from certain jobs, or making it harder for them to sue in local courts. Others flirted with treating newcomers almost like foreigners, charging higher fees or denying basic civil rights. The Constitution's Privileges and Immunities Clause was an attempt to tamp this down, insisting that citizens of each state be entitled to the privileges and immunities of citizens in the several states. The phrase was fuzzy, but the idea was simple. If you're an American, you shouldn't become a legal second-class person just because you crossed a state border. Over the years, courts have argued about which rights count: access to courts, ability to earn a living, certain basic protections, but the clause has quietly worked as an internal glue, pushing states to treat each other's citizens with a baseline level of fairness. It didn't stop them from drawing lines in areas like voting, tuition, or some professional licenses, but it did build a constitutional presumption that the Union is a single community, not a collection of feuding fiefdoms guarding their privileges against roving strangers. 82. The ex post facto ban. The Constitution forbade retroactive criminal laws, protecting people from shifting legal traps. In the turbulent years before the Constitution, legislatures sometimes treated criminal law like a weapon they could sharpen after the fact, punishing opponents for things that were legal when done. They could redefine past behavior as a crime, increase penalties after conviction, or tweak statutes so that disfavored individuals suddenly found themselves guilty under new rules applied backward. The framers, many of whom had watched British Parliament and colonial assemblies abuse legal power, wanted none of that in their new system. So they dropped in a simple but powerful rule: neither Congress nor the states could pass ex post facto laws, criminal laws that reach backward in time to worsen someone's situation. That meant you had to know in advance what conduct was illegal and what punishment you faced. The government couldn't move the goalposts later and then call you a criminal for failing to see the future. Courts later limited the ban to criminal, not civil laws, which meant legislators could still sometimes change rules retroactively in areas like taxes or regulations. But on the criminal side, the clause became a basic shield, one of the Constitution's quiet promises that, however harsh the law might be today, you wouldn't wake up tomorrow to find yesterday's ordinary behavior suddenly reclassified as a crime. 83. The habeas corpus protection. Suspending habeas corpus was tightly limited, reflecting fear of arbitrary imprisonment. For people who had grown up under a king, The most terrifying power wasn't taxation or trade regulation, it was the knock on the door at night. The English tradition of habeas corpus, the right to challenge your detention before a judge and demand the jailer justify it, was one of the few tool subjects had against being disappeared into a dungeon on vague accusations. The framers elevated that safeguard into their new constitution, not by creating it but by protecting it. The privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended, they wrote, except in cases of rebellion or invasion when public safety might require it. Even then, they left open who exactly could suspend it, a question that would provoke fierce arguments during the Civil War when Abraham Lincoln claimed that power for the executive. The underlying fear was clear. Without a functioning habeas process, any government, monarch, parliament, or elected president could lock people up indefinitely without having to prove anything in court. By making suspension the rare, emergency exception rather than the rule, the Constitution tried to keep one foot planted on the side of individual liberty, recognizing that the most basic test of a free society is whether it must explain itself when it takes away your freedom. 84. The treason definition. Treason was narrowly defined to prevent the charge from becoming a political weapon. In much of European history, treason was a flexible accusation that rulers used to crush enemies, critics, or inconvenient rivals with a legal veneer. Speak against the king, lose a battle, back the wrong faction, and you might suddenly find yourself branded a traitor, your property confiscated, your family punished for generations. The framers, fresh from a revolution that Britain had literally called treason, knew how dangerous that label could be if left to political passion. So they did something unusual. They wrote the definition of treason directly into the Constitution and made it stingy. Treason against the United States would consist only in levying war against them, or adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort, and no one could be convicted unless two witnesses saw the same overt act or the accused confessed in open court. Congress could set the punishment but was barred from corrupting the blood, punishing descendants or seizing property beyond the traitor's lifetime. In locking the definition down this way, the framers deliberately made it hard to stretch treason to cover dissent, opposition, or mere unpopularity, forcing future governments to find other, more precise charges instead of reaching for the most explosive word in the political vocabulary every time someone angered those in power. 85. The two-witness rule. Convicting treason required two witnesses to the same overt act or confession in court. The framers didn't just define treason narrowly, they wrapped it in procedural barbed wire to keep it from becoming a casual accusation. In English history, it was often enough to have a single frightened witness, a coerced statement, or political hysteria to send someone to the scaffold. The Constitution tried to slam that door shut by insisting that no one could be convicted unless on the testimony of two witnesses to the same overt act, or on confession in open court. Not two people repeating rumors, not two witnesses to different suspicious acts, two sets of eyes on the same concrete deed, or a public confession where pressure and secrecy were harder to hide. That standard made treason prosecutions rare and difficult, which was exactly the point. If the government wanted to call you a traitor, it had to prove it with more than fear and imagination. 86. The amendment formula. Article V made change possible but difficult, balancing stability with adaptation. When the Constitution was drafted, no one pretended it was perfect, but they also didn't want it rewritten every election cycle. Article V built a deliberately awkward machine for change. Amendments could be proposed by 2/3 of both houses of Congress or by a convention called at the request of 2/3 of the states, and they wouldn't take effect unless 3/4 of the states ratified them. That's a very high bar, one that ensures only ideas with broad sustained support can actually alter the text. At the same time, it was a radical departure from older systems that treated founding charters as untouchable. Instead of sacred scripture, the Constitution became something more like durable software with a hard-to-unlock update function, allowing future generations to correct errors, expand rights, or adjust structures without tearing everything down and starting from scratch. 87. The unamendable clauses. The Constitution temporarily shielded the slave trade and permanently protected equal state suffrage in the Senate. For a document famous as a blueprint for change, the Constitution quietly froze a few things in place. One was the transatlantic slave trade, which the framers agreed Congress couldn't ban before 1808, and even that protection was given an extra layer of armor by being placed beyond amendment during that period. Southern delegates wanted reassurance that their property and human beings and the lucrative traffic in enslaved Africans wouldn't vanish overnight under a new national government. The other unamendable rule was that no state could be deprived of equal representation in the Senate without its consent, locking in the principle that Wyoming and California would always get the same number of senators regardless of population. These carve-outs show the deal-making under the surface. To get a stronger union, the framers traded away the possibility of early abolition of the slave trade and permanently entrenched a structural tilt toward smaller states in one chamber of Congress. 88. The convention revision surprise. Delegates were sent to revise the articles, but instead produced an entirely new framework. On paper, the Philadelphia Gathering of 1787 was supposed to be a modest repair job on the Articles of Confederation, tweaking a leaky system so it wouldn't sink. The delegates arrived with instructions from several state legislatures telling them to patch, not replace, the existing structure. But once they started talking, it became clear that many of them thought the articles were beyond saving. No power to tax, no executive, no effective way to enforce national decisions. Behind closed doors, they quietly abandoned the idea of revision and set about drafting an entirely new constitution, complete with a different balance of power, a new national government, and a fresh ratification process that went straight to special state conventions. Legally, it was questionable. Politically, it was bold. Historically, it worked, though it left behind an enduring tension between the story we tell about careful reform and the reality of a small group deciding to rewrite the rules altogether. 89. The signature order by states. Delegates signed by state delegations, highlighting the Union's federal structure even after we the people. When it came time to sign the finished Constitution, the delegates didn't line up alphabetically or by personal rank. They signed under the names of their states. The document closes with a list that runs from New Hampshire to Georgia, each group of signatures clustered under a state heading, even as the preamble famously begins with "We the people of the United States." That small stylistic choice hints at the uneasy compromise at the heart of the system, a national government claiming authority from a single people, but assembled from sovereign states guarding their identities. Some states had full delegations sign, others had only a few names, since several delegates refused to support the final product. The state-by-state layout preserved the image of a federal compact, a reminder that this new government was both a union of individuals and a league of distinct political communities agreeing, cautiously, to bind themselves together. 90. The printer Dunlap and Claypool. Philadelphia printers quickly produced copies that carried the Constitution into the ratification fight. Once the convention finished its work, the Constitution didn't become real until people could actually read it, argue about it, and decide whether to accept it. That task fell first to Philadelphia printers, John Dunlap and David Claypool, who received the text and rushed it into type, producing the earliest printed versions that could be distributed to officials, newspapers, and curious citizens. Their broadsides and pamphlets became the raw material for the ratification debates, passed hand to hand, read aloud in taverns, reprinted in far-off towns. In a world without mass electronic communication, speed mattered. The quicker copies spread, the faster supporters could frame the conversation and opponents could rally resistance. Those first printings weren't just ink on paper, they were the Constitution's launch vehicles, turning a document signed in a closed room into a public object that farmers, merchants, and artisans could see, question, and ultimately vote to accept or reject. 91. The Pennsylvania Packet publication. Newspapers spread the Constitution rapidly, turning secret debates into a public national argument. The moment Dunlap and Claypool finished setting the type, the Constitution started slipping the leash of Philadelphia and moving outward. One of the first big relays was the Pennsylvania Packet, a widely read newspaper that printed the full text on September 19, 1787. Up to that point, the Constitution had been the guarded project of a small circle of elites meeting behind closed doors. Once it hit the packet, it became fuel for coffeehouse arguments, tavern debates, and kitchen table readings. Printers in other cities copied the text from the packet, sometimes word for word, sometimes with their own commentary attached. By the time wagons carried bundles of papers into the countryside, the country was already fragmenting into Federalists and Anti-Federalists, and what had been a secret convention suddenly turned into a very loud, very public national referendum on what kind of government Americans wanted to live under. 92. Mercy Otis Warren's critique. The influential writer warned the new Constitution could endanger Republican liberty without stronger safeguards. Mercy Otis Warren was no fringe crank. She was a respected revolutionary thinker who'd spent years skewering British tyranny with her pen. When she read the proposed Constitution, she saw less a triumphant climax to the revolution, and more a potential beginning of a quiet counter-revolution. In her observations on the new Constitution, she warned that concentrating power in a distant national government without a Bill of Rights risked turning American liberty into a fragile ornament, easily shattered by ambitious men. She worried about an aristocratic Senate insulated from voters, an energetic executive who might shade into monarchy, and vague clauses that could swallow state authority. Her writing helped crystallize anti-federalist fears that the Constitution's elegant structure hid a dangerous potential for creeping despotism. Warren insisted that if Americans didn't nail explicit protections for speech, conscience, and jury trials into the text, they might wake up one day to find them gone. 93. The Federal Farmer Letters. These widely read essays argued representation in the new republic would be too remote. The federal farmer never signed his real name, but his letters showed up everywhere in the ratification fight, reprinted and discussed like political scripture. He argued that the proposed House of Representatives was simply too small and too distant to reflect the real diversity of American society. How, he asked, could a handful of men from faraway cities possibly understand the needs of backcountry farmers, small artisans, and ordinary laborers spread across a vast territory? In his view, the Constitution's design would tilt power toward the wealthy and well-connected, who had the education, time, and money to travel and serve. Over time, he warned this remote national elite would grow less responsive, more self-interested, and increasingly tempted to govern for themselves rather than for the people. His letters didn't just criticize, they proposed larger representation, more frequent elections, and stronger state governments as counterweights to an emerging national oligarchy. 94. Brutus on judicial power. Brutus predicted the federal judiciary might expand its authority beyond what many expected. Among the anti-federalist writers, Brutus was particularly obsessed with one branch that barely got public attention at first: the courts. He looked at Article 3, saw judges appointed for life with no practical mechanism to remove them, and imagined a future Supreme Court slowly stretching its reach. With the power to interpret the supreme law of the land, he argued, federal judges could gradually redefine the Constitution's vague phrases however they pleased, eclipsing state courts and swallowing local authority. Legislatures might fight back, but their laws would always be subject to judicial veto dressed up as interpretation. Over decades, Brutus warned, the judiciary could become a kind of quiet sovereign, shaping policy from behind the bench without elections or accountability. To him, this wasn't paranoia, it was a structural prediction that a small, insulated group of legal elites would naturally accumulate power precisely because the Constitution built them that way. 95. Publius on faction. Madison's Federalist 10 argued a large republic could better control destructive factions. Writing as Publius, James Madison took on a problem every republic before America had supposedly failed: faction-organized groups driven by passion or interest. Instead of pretending factions could be eliminated, he treated them like fire, dangerous, but ineradicable, and therefore in need of careful containment. His counterintuitive claim in Federalist 10 was that a bigger republic with more people, more interests, and more overlapping loyalties would actually dilute dangerous majorities. In a small republic, one angry group could seize power quickly and crush its rivals. In a vast republic stitched together by representation, factions would have to negotiate, form coalitions, and constantly compromise just to get anything done. The Constitution's structure, separation of powers, federalism, staggered terms was, in his telling, a machine designed to slow down political wildfire. Madison wasn't promising harmony. He was betting that managed conflict in a large arena would be safer than concentrated rage in a small one. 96. Publius on executive energy. Federalist 70 defended a single energetic executive as safer than a weak divided one. To anti-federalists who saw a one-man executive and thought king in disguise, Alexander Hamilton answered with a different fear: paralysis and blame shifting. In Federalist 70, writing as Publius, he argued that a single president with clear authority, a fixed term, and public visibility was actually easier to watch and restrain than a multi-member council where responsibility could be hidden. Energy in the executive, his phrase, meant the capacity to act with speed, secrecy, and decisiveness when the law allowed or required it, especially in foreign affairs and emergencies. A weak, divided executive might avoid tyranny, but it might also invite invasion, corruption, or chaos because no one was clearly in charge. Hamilton's pitch was that unity plus accountability made the office safer. One person to direct, one person to credit or blame, and one person the people could peacefully remove if that concentrated energy ever turned against them. 97. The Constitution's brevity, the document's relative shortness left vast room for interpretation by later generations. Look at the whole thing, and it's startling how thin it is for something that's supposed to govern a continental empire for centuries. No dense civil code, no catalog of everyday crimes, no detailed policy blueprints, just a lean framework, a handful of powers, and some sweeping phrases like necessary and proper, and general welfare that are either elegant or terrifying depending on your mood. The framers cut out a lot of specifics on purpose, partly because they couldn't agree, partly because they knew specifics age badly. That thinness turned the Constitution into less of a finished machine and more of an adaptable toolkit, leaving future generations to bolt on meaning through legislation, judicial decisions, and political practice. Entire constitutional revolutions have happened without a single word of the text changing, simply because courts read a clause differently or Congress used an old phrase in a new way. The brevity that once felt like restraint became the open space where American constitutional conflict now permanently lives. 98. The National Archives display. Today, the Constitution is preserved under special conditions because light and humidity threaten the parchment. The paper that launched all these battles is, physically, a fragile 18th century animal skin sheet that would crumble if you treated it like normal paper. For decades, it bounced around in less than ideal conditions, rolled, folded, moved between buildings until archivists finally convinced everyone that the National Charter shouldn't be aging in a filing cabinet. Now it sits in the National Archives in a sealed chamber with carefully controlled temperature, low oxygen, and barely any light, almost like a high-maintenance patient in permanent intensive care. Every night, the cases can descend into a fortified vault, less out of paranoia than the knowledge that parchment, ink, and sunlight are not friends. Visitors shuffle past and stare for a few seconds at a document that mostly looks like faint brown squiggles, while an invisible army of conservators and engineers monitors humidity levels and microscopic changes. The government that sprang from this text is loud, messy, and overheated. The document itself survives only because we keep it cool, dim, and almost eerily still. 99. The enduring debate over original meaning. Arguments continue over whether constitutional meaning is fixed, evolving, or somewhere between. From almost the moment the ink dried, Americans have been arguing not just about what the Constitution says, but how it should be read. One camp insists that the meaning was largely fixed when ordinary people in the 1780s and 1790s would have understood its words, and that judges today should act like careful historians rather than amateur legislators. Another camp sees the Constitution as a living framework whose broad principles, liberty, equality, due process, must be reapplied as society changes, even when that leads to results the framers never imagined. In between are theories that try to split the difference. Maybe the text sets hard boundaries, but within those lines practice and precedent can grow. These debates shape everything from gun rights and abortion to surveillance, elections, and executive power, turning confirmation hearings and court cases into proxy wars over interpretive methods. The parchment in the archives doesn't move, but its meaning keeps getting pulled back towards 1787, pushed forward into the present, and stretched across the gap in between, night after night, as a restless country tries yet again to decide what its founding words are supposed to mean now.